The Babylonian Captivity was a complicated event which includes many of the best stories and characters in the Bible. In this video, I'll go over a few of those stories, starting with the kings. Judah had been around for a while after the Assyrians destroyed Israel and were beginning to realize the dangers of large empires like the Assyrians. It was then that the current king, the evil Jehoiakim, was invaded and conquered by the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire was the empire that came after the Assyrians. The Babylonians were happy to let them continue to act as king of Judah, but he was forced to obey them and pay a tribute. He followed through with this deal for 3 years and then attempted to rebel. The rebellion went about as well as you could expect fighting against the greatest nation in the world would go, which is not very well. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar then sent him away to Babylon, where he died. The next king of Judah was Jehoiachin, another wicked king. But fortunately, this one's reign ended a lot quicker. Only 3 months after being anointed king, an 18-year-old Jehoiachin was attacked by the Babylonians, much like his father was. Jehoiachin then lived in captivity in Babylon for the rest of his life. But Jehoiachin was later invited into a life of prosperity by his captors. Remember that point. I'll be back to that in a bit. Least but not last was Zedekiah, the final king of Judah. He was yet another bad ruler who didn't care much about his people or the word of God. Clearly, he hadn't listened to the new hit single released by Shishak and the Egyptians, as he decided to, guess, rebel against Babylon. He then had his eyes gouged out and died in prison. Fun! Throughout this whole process, the Judeans were taken in waves to Babylon, eventually leaving only the poorest of Jews to farm the land. Of only a very small number of those who left Judah would ever see their homes again. Let's look at one of my favorite biblical characters, Jeremiah. Nicknamed the Weeping Prophet, Jeremiah was given a challenging task by God. He was told in the first chapter of his book by the Lord himself to bring a prophecy of disaster. His mission was to be a doomsday prophet to the Jews, telling a message of law and punishment, but unlike others, a message of hope. Jeremiah taught that a northern kingdom would soon invade Judea, bringing punishment and disaster. This was because the Jewish people had turned away from God, practicing evil religions and even child sacrifice. He began to accuse the religious leaders in the temples for not respecting the true faith, but instead teaching false doctrine that benefited themselves. For this, Jeremiah was hated. In Jeremiah 34, Jerusalem and the entire southern kingdom is invaded by the Babylonians, fulfilling Jeremiah's prophecies. Jeremiah witnessed the entire event, no doubt experiencing one of the worst I told you so moments in history. As his kingdom was being slowly destroyed, Jeremiah was persecuted by his own people. They hated the message he brought originally and only hated him more as his message rung true. The invasion culminated in Jeremiah being kidnapped by a group of Israelites and brought to Egypt. In the rest of his book, Jeremiah writes about the judgment that Babylon will surely face, as well as the consequences of Judah falling. Since Judah was no longer capable of being a good example for nearby nations, many of them fell worse into whatever sin they had already been committing. As I mentioned earlier, though, this book also contains a message of hope. In the final chapter, the now prisoner Jehoiachin is invited to eat at the king's table, a place of royalty and honor, for the rest of his life. This is one of the clearest ways we can see God working through loss in Jeremiah's story, as it foreshadows the success and prosperity that the Jews will have in Babylon. Now we enter into the 70-year exile that the Jewish people spent in the kingdom of Babylon. Many of the Bible's best books and stories take place during this short time. Before we continue with those stories, though, let's look at my favorite psalm from that time, Psalm 137. Psalm 137 reads, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept, when we remembered Zion. There on our poplars we hung our harps, and we asked our captors for there, our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing these songs of the Lord, well in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. If I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you, according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." The psalm was written in the midst of the Babylonian exile, and we can see how the Jewish people struggled in this time. Almost the entirety of this psalm is painstakingly beautiful until the final stanza, the author curses their captors. The irony that the Babylonians wanted joyful songs from the people, and yet the Jewish musicians wrote a song of anger towards them in secret, is pretty great. Also, there is a fun reggae version. Let's get back to the stories. Daniel was one of the first exiles to arrive in Babylon, along with three of his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All of the strongest and best exiles were gathered together for meals and were fed foods that God forbid the Jews to eat, like pork. Daniel and his friends refused to eat this food, instead asking for only vegetables and water. The king allowed this, and after some time of this new diet, Daniel and his friends were even stronger than the ones who ate the royal food. The king was very impressed and remembered them. Later, the king had a weird dream and asked all of his magicians to help interpret it. After all the magicians couldn't translate his dream using witchcraft, Daniel was asked to interpret it. Through Daniel, God translated the dream, and Daniel was rewarded and promoted. On another occasion, the king had a statue made of himself and ordered all of the people to bow down and praise it. Otherwise, he would throw them into a fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down because they only trusted in the Lord for salvation. The three of them were willingly tied up and thrown into the furnace. But when the king looked into the furnace, he saw 4 men standing there. Immediately, they were let out, and the king commanded the worship of the true God everywhere. Now let's look at some of the impacts the exile had on culture. First, without the Babylonians and the Persians, the New Testament would have looked a lot different. When the Persians came into Babylon, they freed the Israelites. Later, they later went on to take over much of the Middle East and even attempted to take Greece. If the Persians had never been such a threat to the Greeks, Alexander may have never taken over, and the Romans would have never been able to crucify Jesus on a cross. This is because the Romans were almost as derivative of the Greeks as this video is of Wikipedia. Almost. Another thing that was greatly impacted by the exile was the culture of the Jews specifically. One example of this is that their biblical Hebrew alphabet was created during that time, no doubt impacting the generations after the captivity had finally ended. Also, according to the biblical scholar, sorry, I'm definitely going to butcher this name, uh, Yehezkel Kaufman, this event was also what officially split Jewish culture from Israelite, separating the two forever. Now we've looked at both. The history of the exile as well as the cultural significance of it. I think we can all now agree definitively that the exile was one of the most important events in Bible history.